Well, good afternoon. This is the weekly podcast, Life Along the Merrimack. I am Dyke Hendrickson, a former reporter for the Daily News in Newburyport, and I am currently outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum. We discuss the health and history of the Merrimack River. We have a guest today, Peter Doyle. Peter, welcome.
Okay, thanks, Dyke.
He's a great advocate for the river and the former president of the Rotary Club here in Newburyport. He's active in the Amesbury Rotary Club now. I met Peter at an organizational meeting for the Merrimack River Commission about a month ago. This was the gathering of local, state, and federal officials gathered to develop solutions to a serious problem, which is when it rains, a lot of the sewage treatment plants upriver have emissions, sometimes of raw or near raw sewage. Peter is not a public official, but he's very alert to this situation and knows a lot about it, and that's why I'm excited to have him. Peter, why did you attend the meeting of the Merrimack River Commission, and what brought you to this notion that something has to be done to clean up the river?
You know, about 8 years ago, my wife and I moved to Plum Island. We got active in, biking, paddle boarding, kayaking on the river. And one of the first years we were there, the white disc washed down the river from, I think, New Hampshire. That came from a sanitation district. And that's when we started hearing from neighbors. And then we would start kayaking around the corner from the basin. And we would see a brown cloud coming down in the water that was tended to be smelly, and it washed up on the shore. You could see brown, foamy bubbles. People told us that was from sewage discharges. So then I just basically tried to answer the question, if the Clean Water Act was enacted in 1972, why are communities still allowed to do this?
And, as things go along, my understanding is that as climate change is occurring, sometimes we get more rain in shorter periods, and that seems to create a lot of runoff. And in many communities upriver, the rain runoff goes into the sewage treatment plants. Can you talk about that situation? Evidently, that's when raw sewage gets discharged.
Right, so the events are called CSO, Combined Sewage Discharge. It's because years ago, to save money, they put the sewer pipes from the water runoff in with the sewage. If the sewers get too full, it backs over into the sewage system. And to prevent backups into the homes in those communities, they release it into the river instead. And so how I get interested is just starting to talk to some of the political people. Why is this allowed? What is the EPA doing? I believe it's Senator Diane DeGaglio. Mm-hmm. So she invited me to that meeting, just kind of as a concerned citizen. And basically, I just read anything I can learn about the CSOs, the past, why they're still occurring. It's still kind of a head scratcher to me.
And in terms of there have been some bills introduced. Can you talk a little about a bill that was introduced recently on the state level that is going to require some of these treatment plants to at least alert public officials when they have had a discharge?
Yeah, that's been one of the problems is the sanitation districts would release sewage, but they would only report on it once a year. So to me, that's like one of the least neighborly things you can do. Put your sewage into a waterway, have it drift downriver to an unsuspecting neighbor. Now at least they're going to have to warn us.
And there has been discussion. In fact, I think a bill was introduced about a $150,000 program, which the city of Newburyport would administer to let sailors and fishing boats know that a brown cloud is coming downriver. Has this been activated, or is it still in the talking stage?
So that's part of it. So the sanitation districts are required to release that data in 4 hours. It'll be a text or email message. That both are pretty difficult to read. So we want to do that through a software app that people could use on a phone to find out what pipe discharged, when the event started, and potentially when it finished. The old rule of thumb is it's going to take 7 miles to get at that. The river goes 7 miles an hour, so you can calculate the distance of the pipe out to the ocean.
It reminds me of one of my old algebra problems, which I could never figure out. If the river is flowing 7 miles an hour downstream and your canoe is going 4 miles an hour upstream, how long does it take you to get to the Dairy Queen? Well, I could never figure that one out. But, one thing that you mentioned is the warning. my understanding is the program, at least as it relates to Newburyport, would involve flags. Where would these flags be?
So that was part of the bill in the Senate. The House wanted it more electronically, but it would be wherever people are accessing the water, the marinas, the public boat launches up and down the river. Maybe put it on some bridges so boaters, if they're going underneath a bridge, they can see a flashing light or a flag.
So this is a really interesting element. As stated, my guest is Peter Doyle. He has experience in matters relating to Rotary. He used to be the president of Rotary here in Newburyport and is active in Amesbury now. Can you explain how Rotary would get involved in this app? Are you looking for grants? Are you talk a little about the app and Rotary's involvement?
So Rotary around the world we're worried about hygiene, clean water, sanitation. And typically we're raising money to put a freshwater well in Kenya. But after learning about these CSOs, it became pretty obvious that we have a pretty big issue here. And so I talked with some people in Rotary, and they thought a global grant, which then we could solicit money from around the country. It'll just come from Rotarians. And we recently got a grant for $4,000 from a Rotary Club in South Korea. So now we're also trying to there's 18 other Rotary clubs in the Merrimack River watershed. We're also trying to get them to participate.
Well, Rotary is always impressive. I'm not a member, but my wife, Dyke Hendrickson, has been a member for more than a decade here, so we get the magazine. So it is remarkable how Rotary can be international. How would a group in Korea be aware of you over here?
We're really fortunate. Julia Phelps, who's on the worldwide organization for the foundation, is a member of the Amesbury.
Oh, really?
Solicitor. So it was actually a Karen Conrad for the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. So after a meeting with her, I asked, what could Rotary do about the problem with CSOs? And she said, we applied for a grant to develop a software app a year ago. It was declined. And I said, well, let's see if Rotary can create a grant, and we'll pay for the software app to be developed. So that's how we kind of got started. Now, one of the things that's required for a global grant is we have to do a community assessment. So we have a series of 10 questions that we ask people to be aware of, just to see how aware they are of the problem. If they've been to a medical facility because of contacting the water, if a pet's been to the area, if people even know that 600,000 people get their drinking water from the Merrimack.
Well, I through this program, I receive a lot of feedback from people with dogs, and they've gone down to the river on occasion, and a couple days later, the dog, has lesions or is not doing well. Can I read a couple questions that you have put out? This is a Rotary International Grant Needs Assessment, notification system for sewage discharges into the Merrimack River. Now, Peter, one of the questions is, would you consume seafood that is caught in the Merrimack River? And 12% of the people answered yes, and 88% answered no. I think the conclusion is obvious, but what do you make of that? Can you eat fish out of the river?
I see people fishing in the river when we're kayaking or paddleboarding. I see them keep the fish, even if they're out on the jetty. It's even people, they know that's 780 million gallons of sewage went into it, but they're still going to kayak. There's still an appeal, especially, if you're a tourist, if you're not here all year round.
Right.
So it just went through a period of rain where, of course, sewage discharge. Now it's a sunny day, and you're only going to be here for so long. I think people overrule the temptation.
Right.
And I think that's kind of a problem for the EPA. Even though people know that there's sewer in there, it's not dissuading, large. Look at all the boaters who are out there.
And here's one. This was, again, one-sided. This is from the survey of needs. Do you believe that residents along the Merrimack River should be given timely information and notification as to when sewage is released on the river? Now, this was about 99% said yes. So it does sound like boaters and fisher people and all are getting concerned and want to learn more about these discharges.
Yeah, people up in Lawrence at their Rotary Club, they thought people on our end of the river always knew when the discharges were occurring. But I think it's about, 60% say they knew about it, 40% said they did not.
And in terms of, there is close to 600,000 residents obtain their drinking water from the Merrimack River. Now, Barry Connell, the president of the city council, was on our program last week, and he noted that Newburyport is not one of those communities. We're water rich, as he said, but people in the Lawrence area do get their water from the Merrimack.
Yeah, and over Haverhill.
And one of the things when I think of that, of course, they have good technology now to clean the water, but the Merrimack River must be very viable in terms of change, because for almost 2 centuries now there has been different waste put into the river. Lowell began its big run as the largest textile manufacturer in the world in about 1821, so that's about 2 centuries ago. And for many years they dumped raw sewage and everything else into the river. So I guess it's our feeling that the river has ways of surviving, but this is a good time to pay attention to it.
Right. One of the things that, just to get back to getting involved and why these communities are still allowed to dump sewage, even though the Clean Water Act was enacted in 1972, it's because the EPA and the Department of Justice negotiated consent decrees with them. In the decrees, they said that communities like Haverhill, Lowell, and Lawrence couldn't afford to separate their sewage. They typically look at 2% of the gross income of the family as the limit. But on the other side of the forward issue, I see cities like Newburyport, Salisbury, and Amesbury can't afford to continue to live with it. So there's another way to look at it. There are some communities out there that have chosen to split. It's probably the most famous one is the Boston Harbor. In 1989, they split their sewage and sewer. Remember when they used to sing, "We love this dirty water"?
Yeah, right. That was
so
a
dirty
popular
anymore.
song, right? And it should be pointed out that Newburyport and Amesbury are 2 communities who do not mix rainwater and effluent in their systems. And so, we are at the end of the line, so we're a victim of upriver, but, we're doing pretty well in terms of what we release ourselves.
Yeah, it might almost make it hurt worse because the ones closest to the ocean don't do it, but they have to live with it. And I think we have the majority of the marinas and the boats. They're being launched and stored, the fishing, the tourism.
Well, as you know, tourism has grown greatly in the last couple decades. There are 1,500 vessels registered right here in Newburyport, and there's more in Amesbury and Salisbury. And, of course, Cashman Park is the largest put-in in the state for public boating. So people, when I worked at City Hall, would say, this is really our hotel industry in a way. We don't have many hotels in Newburyport, but we have many boats. People come down for the weekend, or sometimes they spend a week on a boat. They go shopping, they go to restaurants. It certainly must be part of your outlook on this, that the economies of Amesbury and Newburyport are very much tied to a clean and desirable river.
Yeah, and I really think it's for the whole river. It's interesting in Lowell and Lawrence, if you look at the per capita income, the poorest families live closest to the river and the wealthiest away, which I really think if we had a healthy Merrimack River, that would be the opposite. People would want to have condos, restaurants, marinas, have taxis going up between the communities to restaurants to show them. And I think that's what happened in Boston. In today's dollars, they've spent $10 billion stopping the CSOs from going into the Boston Harbor, but they calculate it's been $100 billion in economic benefit. So that never gets in the EPA's affordability calculation, or what is the economic benefit? They just look purely at the cost.
Well, one of the intriguing elements of the Merrimack River and what we're talking about is that the Merrimack goes well into New Hampshire. It's actually almost 120 miles long from Plum Island to Franklin, New Hampshire. In fact, I took a drive up there last week and spent quite a bit of time at the Manchester Library. But it strikes me that in order to tackle this, the people, some of the plants, New Hampshire and Manchester, Nashua have to be on board as well.
Right. So right now, the Massachusetts, state legislators making the notification system, but actually Manchester has the most raw sewage is dumped from there, as well as Concord. So at some point, we need to get them involved. But at least with the Massachusetts sanitary plants, at least it's within our control. The legislature's dealing with it. We can come up with the app and start notifying. Hopefully we shame them into taking action.
It's always hard to think about grants and putting a time limit on it. But, in a perfect world, where are you with the Rotary grant and the Rotary app? When might it move forward? Or maybe you can talk about the process.
So the hope is in September, October. So we actually reached out. I just asked around who develops phone apps. I don't know anything about that. It turns out iMark is a digital, I think, advertising agency in Amesbury. And so for the grant, I needed to get a quote. How much would it cost to develop it? So they developed it for me and came up with, some nice options. If we get depending on getting some of the other Rotary clubs to sign on with this, and South Korea already has, once we get up to 25,000, we can start getting active with the development, and then Rotary International will match the other 25.
Well, that's a terrific thing.
Yeah, so I'm hoping over the winter we get it developed, and definitely by next spring, users who want to have it on their phone, they can have it.
Well, I'm thrilled to learn about it because we talk about the river every week, and so this is good detail. I'm with Peter Doyle, who is with Rotary in Amesbury. He is concerned about the river. He's looking to get a grant for an app that will alert people downriver as to when there have been discharges. Have you been able to speak on the North Shore to other Rotaries and try to spread the word in this regard?
So far, I've spoken to Haverhill. I have a meeting with Andover coming up. I'm waiting to get the exact date from Lawrence. So I've reached out to 18 of them. And so the goal, we would like all of them to participate, in the survey. I think it's just a good U.S. project for Rotarians. Just by boat launches, we'll have a Rotary sign with the address where to access the app for a free download. Just to let them, people know that we're concerned about our environment here as well as around the world.
Well, there are 16 communities just on the North Shore that border the Merrimack River, and of course we just said that there are many more up in New Hampshire. Is there much happening on the federal level, Peter, in terms of, when we go back, as we were saying, when Ed Muskie was around in the early 70s, he was a senator from Maine. It took a while to build some momentum, but the Clean Water Act of 1972 turned to be very powerful and very long-lasting, but I think the key there is federal. Do you see any federal activity at this point?
That's why I go back and so we kind of got the situation where we got these communities who say they can't do it, and I think you can learn from the municipalities that are finding a way to do it. Most recently, Baltimore in 2017, they're going to spend $1.6 billion to separate their sewage and water pipes for the Inner Harbor. I didn't see where they got any federal money for that. And so sometimes I've gone to some of the meetings, and you've probably heard some of the politicians stand up and say we're going to get federal money. But I don't know how, Port Huron didn't get federal money, Boston didn't get, Baltimore didn't, St. Paul, Minneapolis. These are all communities who've done it. The best funding I could get was from Port Huron. It looked about 14% of it was from federal grants that were written.
Well, that's a good thought to put in there, because when I talk to people about this, they say, well, this administration is not interested in environmental issues, and you're not going to get any money from them. But if I hear you correctly, there's a good chance that it doesn't have to be all federal, at least initially, that good things can happen. I want to mention something. I went to a seminar several weeks ago, and a fellow from Portland, Maine spoke, and he talked about, about a decade ago, they had similar problems in Casco Bay. And they came up with a plan of what they called the rain tax. And every time it rained a great deal, they knew that they'd have discharges. So they somehow figured out a way that based on the amount of rain, people would be assessed a little more so that they could get a fund going for this type of separation of pipes. Do you think that would work here, or do you think we have too many communities involved?
The one thing is in Boston, they got a lot of the sewage districts together. How they did it is there's municipal bonds. So that allows municipalities to borrow money over a period of 30 years to pay this off. So then they can gradually raise their sanitation district prices. Right now, municipal bonds are paying about 3% interest. When Boston did it, they're about 9.9%. In some ways you could say there's probably never been a better time to do a project that's going to be funded through municipal bonds.
Well, on the federal level, although not the EPA level, I understand that congressional reps Lori Trahan of Lowell and Seth Moulton from the North Shore have made a request for about $500 million to an appropriate committee in House of Representatives. Of course, I think the key element here is a request. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. But those representatives seem to be engaged. Do you get the effect that congressional representatives are looking into this as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. When Boston really got serious is when one of the George Bushes was running against Michael Dukakis. The Bush administration painted him weak on the environment because of the quality of the Boston Harbor. It was known as the most polluted waterway in the country. So I think that was one of the reasons, other than a lawsuit the city of Quincy filed against the Boston Sanitation District, to start taking this seriously.
Yeah, I remember that. That was remarkable because, it did turn out to be, the Dukakis was supervising a very dirty river. And the Merrimack, on a number of occasions, has turned out to be one of the 10 dirtiest rivers. In 2016, as a matter of fact, it was on the list of the 10 dirtiest rivers. And recently, it was on one of the a list for most vulnerable, because in addition to the discharges, there's a lot of development in New Hampshire, a lot of runoff. The environment is changing in New Hampshire. So I think it must be an ongoing battle.
Yeah, so in my mind, kind of like Dukakis running for president, if one of the presidential candidates is going to run for office, the other party could paint him weak on the environment because of the Merrimack River. You wonder if that potentially would, if you want to move offices and move up, don't have this stink in your backyard.
Well, if I hear a snarky question from the back of here in New England, it might be you raising this question.
I try to be thoughtful more than snarky. But.
Okay. Well, every time I see Seth Moulton out on the stump, I'm thinking, gosh, instead of going to Iowa or South Carolina, Seth, couldn't you stick around the North Shore? But then the good part of me says, well, a big problem is New Hampshire, and if he wants to stay in New Hampshire and campaign, maybe part of his little campaign would, hey, the Merrimack River is in tough shape. We here, folks in New Hampshire are going to have to help out. Do you see any, Elizabeth Warren or Seth Moulton, could they be helpful?
Oh, I think they could be really helpful. I think if potentially on the new administration, I know infrastructure is going to be a big topic. Potentially, maybe money would become available. I'm getting older, and so I don't want to necessarily hold out hope. The only way we can do this is with federal money.
Right.
Because I think we can learn from the other communities that have done this.
That's a good point. Now, Peter, how did you find your way to Newburyport? Were you? I don't think you're a native of the city, are you?
No, I was in the manufacturing industry. I came here to be the executive vice president at Bradford and Bigelow, a large book printing facility.
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
And so I was there for about 7 years. Book printing just seemed to be losing its legs. We were laying off more people than we were hiring at the time. And so I just made a decision. I had an MBA from Southern Methodist from years ago with a background in finance, long-term customer of Edward Jones. So just decided to make the switch to
So you're with
finance.
Edward Jones right now in Amesbury?
Yeah, with an office in Amesbury. But fortunately, Bradford and Bigelow is still doing well, and they've got a planned expansion. I still see those folks and wish them well. Just after 32 years in the book printing industry, it seemed like it was enough.
I know. Well, I'm a veteran of the newspaper industry, and I understand where you're coming from. The newspaper industry is not as vibrant as it once was, as expression goes. But, your efforts are, really valuable right now. And I might say to listeners that there are close to a dozen groups on the North Shore working right now, and frequently together to work on this together and make sure things go along. And one group I'm aware of is Merrimack River Watershed Council. Have you spoken with them? And it seems like they have a good role in this situation.
Yes, I'm a member, and I think they really do, good things. I think they're in the process of being reorganized, I think, for the better. And I think if, it's just a perfect time for them to grab this issue, and I'll help them out any way I can.
Mm-hmm. So I'm Dyke Hendrickson. I'm the host of Life Along the Merrimack. I'm talking to Peter Doyle, who is with Rotary, and he is very interested in the health of the Merrimack River. And, talk a little about what it's like to live on Plum Island. Have you enjoyed that experience? I mean, I've heard some of the downsides, but, every time I go down there, it seems like a wonderful place.
Yeah, it seems like the neighbors, compared to being in, Newburyport, in my mind, people are a little more of a melting pot. You get some extremely wealthy people next to some people aren't quite as wealthy, but everybody gets along. Seems to be a nice culture of people. Just the nature, I guess, of people who would live on an island all year round. kind of as that common thread that gets a lot of us are interested in nature, being outdoors.
What percent do you think live through the winter down at Plum Island?
I think it's going up. I think it's about 60% right now.
Well, one of the enterprises down there that I go by frequently is the restaurant on Northern Boulevard. It's reopened, and I've got to say I'm rooting for that restaurant, Peter. I mean, I've seen 2 or 3 of them close. But it must be difficult to be a restaurateur on Plum Island because you have certain strong moments, and through the winter it's a hard slog. Have you been down there? I mean, this is slightly off the subject of the river, but I just
I'm
asked.
the same way. That site has been closed more than it's been open in our years on Plum Island, and we certainly wish them well. We know the couple or the people who purchased it, and we try to get pizzas and burgers and things like that. Sometimes I contrast that to Mad Martha's. Mad Martha's really seems to be a destination where
Right.
people come from Newburyport and will drive out. I think parking is always going to be a problem for restaurants out there, but I think you have to have something really good that you do and make it worth a destination.
Well, the Beachcomber, which is another enterprise down there, it's a restaurant, a bar. It does have good parking. That seems to have weathered the storm. It's been that 5 or 6 years, and on a weekend, it's certainly a very entertaining spot to go.
Yeah, we see a lot of our neighbors there.
So, in terms of kayaking and boating, have you been able to do much of that this spring?
Yes, probably more kayaking so far, this year. But we love to go, around the corner, underneath the drawbridge, into the reserve. Just a beautiful area.
I'm a canoer, so I don't know quite the subtleties of it. Is the tide critical to whether you're going kayaking that morning?
Yeah, because we're putting in, on the basin side right around 60th, and so those are the things you look at. You want to have a good weather day. You want to have the tide timed right. I guess the third thing we should consider are CSOs. But unfortunately, I think if typically CSOs come after a time of stormy weather, finally the sun comes out, the tides are right, and it's almost like the river's calling you. You want to go out,
Yes.
even though it's not. You got to make sure you clean up really well after you get back out of that water.
Now, we had a storm yesterday. It wasn't the largest rainstorm, but nevertheless, have you heard that there were any discharges upstream as a result of yesterday's storm?
Yeah, I heard Lowell had a discharge. They had about 0.9 of an inch of rain, and it caused it. So right now, we know when it started and when it stopped, but they don't necessarily report the gallons of the discharge.
Do you think there'll be a time when, say, your app aided by Rotary gets out there, do you think there'll be a time when a fisherman or a boater would know enough about the moment to check the app and say, well, Haverhill just discharged, or I'm going to go, I don't know. Does each pipe make a difference, I guess my question is.
And sometimes when you talk to go to these meetings, like the mayor, Mayor Gray wanted to know, when can I tell the citizens it's safe to go in? But people talk about testing it. Do you test at the bottom or the top, the sides or the middle? I think you'd really have to have a cross section because it's a cloud coming down. You could be right next to the cloud and it would test good. You'd test within the brown water area. I'm sure it would test pretty poorly. That's why get into how people are framing it. So live in Lowell or Lawrence or Haverhill. How do you say, well, it's okay to flush the toilet and have some of it go out? How do they get their head around that? And I think they say, well, we're treating 98% of it. But that's not really true. That would be like if it was a pipe and they had a mechanism to just put 2% sewage into that. There's times they dump out 40% or 50% that hasn't been treated. It's not going into pipe, it's going into a river. Then they'll say, oh, it's cleaner than it's ever been. But, I would like to frame it. If you live in those communities and you flush the toilet on a rainy day and know there's a pretty good chance it's going to be released, do you say a prayer for the citizens of Newburyport?
Well, we always try to be delicate on this subject, Peter. But one thing your poll pointed out that to the question, are you aware of human health hazards associated with sewage contamination? And 88% said yes, and more than half said they were aware of challenges in the river. So in our final seconds here, Peter, how would you sum up what we have here? Do we need more unity? We need Rotary. We just need a lot of people to cooperate.
I think the first part of having this app and even having people fill out the assessment is just awareness. I hope some people got more knowledgeable of what's going on in the river just by filling out the questions. And I could tell by some of the people who would write handed responses that they were. What's interesting is people knew more about the hazards to humans, but not animals. And actually, people know more animals that have been treated than humans.
Yeah, I've heard that myself. As I mentioned before, I've had a number of people go to Cashman Park, for instance, and they love to let their dogs out there, and the dogs get in, and 2 days later they have lesions. So it's of great concern. Well, this is Dyke Hendrickson, the host of Life Along the Merrimack. I've been talking with Peter Doyle, who is an advocate for the Merrimack River, trying to make it cleaner.